Welcome, everyone. I'm Jamie Monson. I'm the director of the African Studies Center here at Michigan State University. And it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here, to also welcome our guests from Stellenbosch University in South Africa, here as part of our Mellon Foundation-funded Ubuntu Dialogues project all this week. And we're really fortunate that Dr. Mosa Phadi agreed to give a talk in our Eye on Africa series during their very busy and demanding week of administrative and all kinds of other work that we've been doing this week. I'll just say a few words about the Ubuntu Dialogues project. This project started in 2016, and it was an outgrowth of a long-term relationship between the Michigan State University Museum, especially Marcia McDowell and Kurt Dewhurst. Kurt's here today. And they invited us in the African Studies Center to join them in 2016 to do a learning event in South Africa on the theme of museums as a site of dialogue and engagement in transforming institutions, especially in the movement to decolonize institutions. So we began not only by doing a learning event, but by first developing a partnership with the museum under the directorship of Dr. Bongani Mgijima. And that turned into a 2-year project funded by the Alliance for African Partnership. Some of you have been a part of that. And now the Mellon-funded project for 3 years that will include student exchanges, faculty seminars, and also student dialogues, the Ubuntu Dialogues, and Dr. Efyong is here, who's been one of the facilitators of those dialogues. So Musa's visit is part of that engagement. We've already had 2 other visitors as part of the seminars, Dr. Punla Gobodo Madikizela, and this Monday we had Funzo Sidogi here talking in the museum about his work on art and art history. Well, we're very happy to have you here, Mosa. Musa has completed a PhD at the University of Johannesburg, South Africa, on focusing on the history of W.E.B. Du Bois in South Africa. She's been a researcher for many years. She's published in a number of peer-reviewed journals, and she's also produced a research documentary on the middle class in Soweto. She plays the role of program manager for our Ubuntu Dialogues at Stellenbosch, where she's a postdoctoral fellow at the Chair of Historical Trauma and Transformation. Her research focus is on class, race, and Marxism, and we're looking forward to her presentation on those topics today. Melissa, you're warmly welcome to MSU.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I think as a disclaimer, maybe, my work it's influenced primarily by the movement. I've been involved in the anti-privatization forum in Johannesburg, later on around the Democratic Left, which was another grassroots organization when the anti-privatization forum changed its position, and a number of other issues when it shut down, really. And then I'm part of a small propaganda group, a reading group called Keep Left, which is a very Trotskyite approach. So my work it's drawn from a very Marxist alliance. I don't know if you know, South Africa, there's been a huge tradition in the academy, especially where there's like the division between liberal sort of like scholars and also Marxist tradition, which is primarily focusing on the working class and the mutation of the working class. So I'm very, I've chosen a position. So you can argue from that. So that's part of it. And also, like, one of the key things when I've been in the movement since like my undergrad, really, it's like, how do we think because of decolonization, the fees must fall? But mainly I was inspired by the economic freedom fighters, Julius Malema, in terms of like now starting to think about race and blackness in particular, because there was a time when Julius Malema, before he became the EFF himself, with the democratic DA, Democratic Alliance, so black people were moving into and becoming members of the Democratic Alliances and in the leadership of the Democratic Alliance, which is like historically white party. And there was an issue around who are these black people who are, they are sellouts or, the kitchen girls or tea girls, which is usually is to demean someone when you call them that in South Africa. And they were called those names, those black people who joined the DA in that particular zone. Then it led to my PhD in thinking about blackness. What does it actually mean? I don't define it myself. I ask people after post-apartheid, how do you, what is being black in the world? What is it being black in South Africa in that level? So it's in two folds. It's people's understanding of being black and also approaching and trying to extend and having a conversation with Marxist scholars, because I come from that tradition, especially Marxist scholars in South Africa who've been, shamefully so, but they've been quite bad on the question of race and that type of questions. Then I encountered W.E.D. Bois, so in that process, so I'm having 3 conversations at once. So I'm hoping that you can follow my thinking. This is based on my empirical work, mainly. So to start off, I'm going to read because I'm having a jet lag a little bit, so my English runs out. So to remember words in English, I will read some of the things, okay? So, yeah, to start off, I will start off with a quote from Bill Hooks. Nowadays, it's fashionable to talk about race or gender. The uncool subject is class. It is the subject that makes us all tense, nervous, uncertain about where we stand. Marxism sector laments has become a victim of vicious attacks. It's been labeled as racist by, among others, Africanist scholars. It's been accused of class reductionism, stigmatized as foreign ideology within its genealogy in Europe. Wilderson, for example, argues that the black subjects reveal Marxist inability to think white supremacy as the base. In doing so, calls into question Marx's claim to elaborate a comprehensive, decisive antagonism. Marxism is therefore in a conceptual crisis. Mangu adds to this critique, noting that white academia and black Marxism in South Africa operates according to a discredited anthropological conception of race by not being aware of the historical, social, and political ways in which identities have been constructed. These claims appear to find confirmation when some Marxist scholars, such as David Harvey, continue to argue that the struggle against police violence, municipal courts, white supremacy do not transcend or supersede capital and its contradiction. This approach, dominant amongst much Marxist scholars, views race outside the logic of capital. If this thinking prevails, Roediger anticipates a world where neither race nor class will be closer to being addressed. The present article seeks to expand insights on the debate opened up by Roediger that considering race does not suspend class. Class first debates often conceal the racial-based inequalities that still exist, mainly affecting black people. Using empirical evidence, this article will affirm that it is unsatisfactory to see it as class issue rather than a race issue. Although Roediger emphasizes the need to analyze both race and class, he fails, however, to ground his key arguments within people's daily experiences. This article will use grounded experiences of being black in South Africa to explore the nexus of race and class. The article goes further to demonstrate that race matters and how blackness is experienced and articulated, even though the dominant scholarship frames black ontology within an inferiority positionality. Therefore, being black becomes a reliable signifier in understanding race and how class moves over various periods of time. To argue this, The article grounds itself in a conversational analysis and a critical engagement with W.E. Du Bois's theory of double consciousness. This analysis seeks to elaborate and extend on Du Bois's theory of double consciousness. Du Bois was highly influential both in the United States and South Africa, and later orientated his work towards advancing Marxist tradition. His concept of double consciousness not only highlighted the ontology of being black, but also stretched the idea of race and class, which pioneered the understanding of blackness. This article argues that being black in post-apartheid South Africa produces multiple consciousness, complicating the orthodox tendencies of thinking about race and class, while Du Bois's theory of double consciousness articulates being black within the confines of two-ness. Multiple consciousness, which describes existing in a thrall of multiple folds which interact to disrupt the collective history of oppression. Various dimensions such as shapes blackness. In this article, language, culture, ethnicity emerge as a particularly strong shaping forces. Among the elites, these dimensions were often articulated through a theoretical framing of what is meant to be black. Among the ordinary people, the meaning attached to being black was more fluid. So I interviewed, let me just give you a background. I interviewed highly profiled black people, from academics who are well known in South Africa to very flamboyant business billionaire guy to a mine owner and she owns coal mines and so on. So those were the elites that I interviewed, and the ordinary move from young profession to professions to students and homeless people, unemployed people, people living in informal settlements. So there's that division that I'm making in that process. Then, where am I now? Okay. When black people usually, this is Roediger's understanding usually, when black people take over the state, it is frequently assumed race does not matter. But this assumption totally disregards different opportunities with regards to wealth, poverty, confinement and freedom, citizenship and alienation. Capitalism manages to assimilate, adapt to new conditions. New forms of structural racisms are developed and validated. The present South African context, similar to the US, shows that white supremacy persisted. Roediger argues not only by working against the forces of freedom, of openness or economic rationality, but also working through them. This process validates, creates, recreates the logic of racism. In theorizing blackness, some contemporary scholars argue that blackness is absent until encounters with the other. And I use the word the other rather than whiteness, so we can have that in a discussion. However, in line with Wright, who cites Stuart Hall, my findings present black identity not only as a singular, essential, ahistorical, given, fixed, but as a multiple conjunction and always in process. In other words, blackness is a unifying term due to the historical inferiority position that it has enjoyed. But this unity is fragmented by a number of dimensions at different points, which are classed. For example, when you're holding one's fist like this into a fist, the fingers creates a unifying shape of various sizes, yet the dividing lines between the fingers have a potential to disrupt that unity. African blackness in particular is in fact rather complex, and this ought to be taken up more seriously and rigorously in the conceptualization of blackness. According to the elites and ordinary participants in the study, the pain of apartheid haunts what being black means for them. This haunted history is more pronounced amongst individuals who lived their teenage years during this era of apartheid. Leslie, a senior researcher in one of the biggest think tanks and one of the study's elite participants, narrates these daily encounters of inferiority. And I quote from Leslie, "I was born in 1968. That is when my father was jailed. In fact, my mother gave birth to me when my father was in jail. So I grew up being conscious of the fact that I'm black. You are not allowed to go to the same toilets. There is a bucket system, and you knew that other people had proper sanitation. I remember my aunt, who was a domestic worker. She was asked by the madam, historically, white people who hire black people were called madams, white women in particular, madams. She was asked by the madam for us to be garden boys. I will play with him, a white boy, he's narrating, and he's enjoying it. But he goes into the house. We had to go at the back room. I'm giving you a scene of a white boy playing with me. I could see this boy, his life, but he could never see my life. The hovering imagery of scarce resources due to spatial segregation is rooted in the memory of what it is meant to be black during apartheid. The elite mostly now reside in former white areas, narrates the poverty they experienced when growing up as part of their childhood memory, currently a little removed from its harsh experiences. Among the poor and unemployed, however, the apartheid past of poverty and inferiority is still their present reality in post-apartheid South Africa. And I quote Connie, being black is painful. I'm hurting. Things do not go well for us black people. We are still struggling even now. We voted, but there is no difference. There are no jobs. We do not receive housing. It is still the same. When it rains, we are affected because we are poor. Maybe when you are white, when you are a white person, it is better because they live a different life. Those who could not move to previously white areas after the dawn of apartheid, especially the homeless and those who live in informal housing, articulated their suffering as a lack of recognition. Inherited race-based inequality has created conditions in which the poor are the forgotten. Amongst the emerging middle class, who also form part of the ordinary in the study, who went to former white schools, who are presently young professionals or students in university. Most were infants or toddlers at the dawn of the current regime. Among those interviewed, blackness is seen through the gaze of the other. Growing up, their constant encounter with the other has created an environment in which they were constantly reminded that they were different. The other made them question themselves, feel inferior. Koketso recalls how she first recognized she was black when she began attending a former white school. And I quote, "I would say the first time when I really felt it was when we were in Durban. Durban is one of the cities in South Africa. In primary school, when this boy called me a gaffe, I even went home and I asked my parents, what is a gaffe? This word is very strange to me. I never really heard it, And when I was in primary school, another guy asked me why my nose is so flat. I asked my father, why do I have a flat nose, not a pointy nose like my other friends? And my dad said, you are black, so you will have African features. It is mainly through my primary school. By then, I really knew I was black. Among those who went to township schools is still, the black schools, they remain black schools in the township, designated areas in the townships of black people. Among those who went to township schools, however, expression of blackness, it was a sense of pride. This pride can perhaps be explained in two ways. First, it might be assumed that those who had less contact with the other do not doubt their sense of being black. Or secondly, this sense of pride might demonstrate how structural alienation has created an acceptance of the impoverished conditions associated with being black. For Marsha, to be black is to be natural. White people look like they are forged, but us, we are natural. They change, they turn pink, purple, but us, we are just black. When it is hot, we are black. When it is cold, we are black. Although inferiority frequently occupies a central emphasis of scholarship on Blackness, there are moments of joy which embody the ontology of being Black. Gilroy refers to profound moments that exist in between the daily tension of oppression as small freedoms. He gives an example of a jazz singer who has no solution to his moral or metaphysical Black historical problems, who can air some of the tension through song. These small freedoms enables the singer to have joy. Driving a beautiful car, listening to jazz, do not give the singer human freedom, but ease some aspects of inferiority. Kolela, a prominent scholar and one of the elites in my study, recalls his immediate childhood by narrating a story of a storm which wrecked his township to the point that it destroyed a bridge that connected them to the town. The river was impassable. The traumatization of Black people and how we had to journey from the township to town, having to cross this river. Even in the midst of this environmental disaster, he has joyful memories of playing rugby in the local squad. Among the ordinary, music reencountered as a central to that small freedom. Music frees the imagination, evokes a collective ownership of their own space, a feeder of non-interrogation, a blissful nature of seeing the world. And I quote Gwena. He's reflecting about his father. To this day, referring to his father, his love for music has been a creative gateway into a bigger life, an imagination beyond the squalor of our four-room house. The older I get, the more I understand how there is an organic social process that gives you your toolbox, an urban toolbox. You learn the songs, poetry, oral stories, how people dress, and you get all of that from music. There's been a huge contestation around like language in South Africa. For a very long time, the division between Afrikaans and English, and during the struggle, Afrikaans was seen as the language of the oppressor, and English later by Black people was seen as the language of the liberation. Even Steve Biko, when he speaks about it, everybody has different language, but the one thing that unifies some of us is that we can able to communicate is through English. But after 1994, because of people were going to former white schools, some of the children actually can't speak African languages. They only speak English. Black people, they only speak English. So it has created tensions in Blackness, and what does it mean for those who can't speak an African language in that regard. And the tension around language, especially English, is in twofolds. That's what I'm arguing. First, English is a form of social currency which smooths assimilation into the other to expand the pool of opportunities to advance in that world. Secondly, English complicates the need to preserve a cultural heritage which defines Blackness. As Ngugi confirms, even at their most radical pro-African position in their sentiments and articulation of problems, they still took the renaissance of an African culture lay in the language of Europe. And there's been issues around culture in South Africa as well. How do we actually preserve not only the language, but also culturally? And there's been tensions, especially coming from the feminist position. Some of the tensions is that culture is actually, perpetuates misogyny in one level. And those have been critical things. So aspects, most of the people who are ordinary, the aspects of the culture that actually they want to preserve, like lobola, what is it in English? Dowry. Yes, yeah, where you pay someone to get married. And so, as part of it. So some of the young people want to preserve this, especially some of the young women want to preserve some aspects of it. There's also some people want to preserve like ancestry as part of the cultural aspects. But also, of course, there is like utwala, which is like adoption of women and so on, that has actually created a controversy as well, and how do we deal with it? And also polygamy, where black men they love the idea more often, especially the elites, in the conversation of getting more than one woman as part of the aesthetic of wealth. So there's been aspects of that as well that has created these things. But also there's been ethnicity. So in ethnicity, if during apartheid, the township was not only segregated between black and white, but also was segregated amongst ethnic groups. So there'll be a section in the township for Sutus, there'll be a section for Zulus, there'll be a section for vendors and Shonas and so on, Shanganis and so on. That section. So it created a little bit of tension during apartheid, and some of the elites, especially the older generation, speak about the little tensions between that. I don't know if you remember just before the elections in South Africa, the hostels, which were predominantly Zulu men staying there, attacking the township in different ways. So it has created tensions, and also if you go to Johannesburg, the taxi rank or the taxi industry often is owned by Zulu speaking people. So also how that creates the tension amongst black people. But I think even though ethnicity is not in conflict in the same level as elsewhere in the continent, but has created a space with the xenophobic violence in one level that we can speak about, where, it is part of our fabric in different ways, and part of my interview shows, there's like, with the xenophobic violence that is happening in South Africa, some of the elites is like, this is safe hate, the people don't understand, like they are part of, African immigrants are part of us, and actually this is devastating. But even in that sense of speaking about it, it's like, it's very missionary approach, and the ordinary people is like, yes, they shouldn't be killed, but technically they're not, black people like South Africans, but they should not be killed as part of it. So there's still that tension of division in between that as well. And as things progress amongst the elite in thinking about class, a lot of the elite people I spoke to, they say the black elite, Eric, for example, says the black elite is like, it's too small to actually make a difference. That's the divisions that they say. But among the ordinary people, and I'm quoting from the Rato, there's a difference between us. Those who live in suburbs, which are historically white areas, that we call them suburbs, those who live in suburbs do not have the same lives as those who live in informal settlement. In informal settlement, there is no electricity or water. Those in suburbs have everything as part of the notion. So people are very aware, even though it's not a discussion, even though there's a denial amongst the elite that it be too small to be worried about. I think there are bigger problems, which is the bigger problem is always the white elite and having the monopoly over the economy. That's been the key thing. And trying to conclude in this, we can talk about these things. I'm just throwing it as part of the discussion. In conclusion, in the ongoing debates within Marxism about race and class, there's little interrogation of how blackness is directly understood and expressed. Using empirical evidence, I've begun to show how being black and the meaning attributed to blackness are important and should form part of the conversation. In Marxism, especially how race and class divisions are manifested and reproduced. Grounded experiences are essential as they demonstrate both the experiences of inferiority as well as the small freedoms of Black ontology. They show Blackness is reconstructed over time. In post-apartheid South Africa, the many meanings attached to being Black produces multiple consciousness, which is fluid, which has potential to express itself as a collective progressive to fight forms of oppression. But multiple consciousness can also incite reactionary regressive politics depending on the condition and the balance of power at that particular time. Some of the elites and the ordinary people have indicated that the ideas of what it means to be Black has elements of politicized orientation, rebelling against the system, yet at the same time the collective expression were also confined within boundaries of conservative ideas. This conservativeness was most acute in the discussions of culture, the views of African immigrants, and some of the elites and ordinary people held on to culture in ways that constrains the gains made in gender relations and empowerment of women. It is the opposite to return to Du Bois' theory of double consciousness at play in unpicking how people articulate the meaning attached to being Black. You know, this whole idea that, of Du Bois, it's a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of the other, of measuring one's soul by the tape of the world that looks on in assumed contempt and pity, one of the ever-tuners. Among the elites and some of the people, the construction of Black and apartheid was based on denying Black people basic materials, which confined the ability to enter the world of opportunity, namely the other. Even though the elites and some of had interactions with the other, the veil explicitly restricted their Blackness during apartheid. Thus, double consciousness was useful during that era. However, in the current era, it loses its meaning due to the fractured Black ontology. Yet in post-apartheid context, experience and meaning has become considerably more complicated than the concept of double consciousness captures. On one level, after apartheid, the structural barriers which acutely alienated the worlds of Black and the other has been blurred because of the constitutional framework which has made South Africa a unified state. The Constitution has enabled anyone who has the economic ability to partially enter beyond the veil of the other. Those who can afford, for example, can attend previously white schools. In the process, a peculiar reconstruction of consciousness occurs. The veil which Black people once fought against is partially open. Access to dazzling opportunities is possible for people with material means. But entrance beyond the veil only superficially gives the impression that being Black can only be recognized as human. This entry is followed by a complex demands of participation. Black people are required to perform, prove their worth. The material resources which partially elevate Black people to some equality are confronted by compromises and complicity. Entry is distorted. Access to liberties does not necessarily equate to acquiring human status. Their inferiority is evoked, their worthiness is tested, their ability to think and find space within the given liberties is in perpetual state of contestation. They can never be fully they could never be worthy enough despite efforts to match up to those who constructed them as inferior. The free man has not yet found his promised land. The unfilled promised land is a source of ongoing crisis, both for those who entered the veil and those who are forgotten and still trapped within the cycle of poverty. Multiple consciousness further extend and demonstrate how being Black is ingrained within ties of race and class in a world which remains unequal. As a result, being Black is stretched from itself, within itself, towards itself. From itself, because Black people have partial access to the veil. Within itself, by attempts to balance an equilibrium of having access to the veil and maintaining relations with those remain forgotten in the present context. Towards itself, as they are confronted with the reconstruction of being Black, which disrupts, assimilates, questions what it means to be Black. Being Black presently, especially amongst the elites, require the acquisition of a habit of the veil to maintain social currency, yet subvert those habits which are locked within the paradigm of the veil. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much. We have time for questions and for discussion. I know that there are lots of parts of the talk that we could get into more deeply. As everyone knows that's been here before, this is a microphone that we'd like you to use when you ask a question. It lets your voice be heard by those who are watching online with the live stream. It doesn't amplify your voice. So please do use this. So we're open for questions.
Thank you. This is probably not directly related specifically to your conceptual and theoretical background, but I'm working with some colleagues here on sending Michigan State students, young students, freshmen and sophomores, to South Africa for an experience there. Mm-hmm. And we're interested in what should we tell these young people about the basic realities in contemporary South Africa. I understand it's all very complex and we don't have much time, but we would like for the students to have some, at least basic understanding of the current realities that, as you just described, are extremely complex.
Do I answer?
Yeah, go
okay.
ahead.
I think the idea of a rainbow nation is being polluted. As we move further into our democracy, 25 years later, I think if someone is still thinking about South Africa and think it's a rainbow nation, there's unity, I think it will be a mistake. Have things changed? Things have radically changed in various forms. Have certain things stayed the same? Some things have stayed exactly the same, especially for Black people, the people who have not lost in this democracy 25 years later is white people. They've either maintained their middle class or actually gotten even much more wealthier than before. And that's where the things are. In one level, there was a time in South Africa, and I'm saying reflecting also living in Stellenbosch, there was a time in South Africa for maybe 10 years after 1994 where people, even white people, are afraid to talk about racism. There was the first 10 years. Right now, the brutality of white people and asserting their whiteness beyond themselves has become that, and has coinciding with the extremeness of also Black people, especially young people, angry at the regime for things not being changing. And also coupled with the economy that is shrinking. So there's been huge extremes in a context of a declining economy, and also very, very politicized young people than ever before. There was a time in my generation, even generation before, probably we were grateful to be in a space where young people can just be accepted in white spaces, or like going to former white universities. You work hard as you can, you study, you pass. And you do, and prove to white people that you can think. Now it's beyond that. The younger generation are asking for more. Our generation yes, we can think and we want more, but actually the space has to change. both inside, but also the political regime has to change. The ANC is in, I don't know, what's the English? It's in tatters. It's in, what is the shambles in itself, cannot hold the center at all. Politically, they don't have ideas of what needs to be done. And I think with the Zuma regime, it showed to the extreme of like how things can possibly go wrong. With a huge, I wouldn't say corruption, but I think it's a lack of what democracy should look like. I don't think they have a solution to the crisis. And rightly so, because South Africa was built for, not historically, it was not built for black people. Then for the very first time, you have to think about state formation. You have to think about a state as a collective. You have to integrate all those fragmented places, and also institutionally. And it's been uneven. There's been certain spaces where some things work, but there's been certain spaces there's been huge crisis, both institutionally, both also materially. And I don't think ideologically the ANC knows what the solution should look like. I think the method that they used was that they will just adapt the old World Bank ideas and put it together, but it's not working. Then you find the contradiction that comes with, that has spelled out in that crisis, that has spelled out Afrikaner nationalism, which is increasing. The last election shows that there is a huge Afrikaner nationalism, has spelled out very conservative ideas of like black, sort of like Christian, super Christian, sorry, I'm not offending anybody, it's like lack of English in this, of super conservative Christian parties that are actually emerging, that split, that then fragmented, but actually when you count all those conservative religious or cultural parties that actually contested for election, it's a huge number of voters who actually voted for those conservative parties. So there is a wave, as much as there's an Afrikaner nationalism, there's a wave also of a black conservativeness that is simultaneously happening that we haven't studied in our level. Then there's the DA, the liberal approach, which black people actually have voted. 8 million black people still, like, people voted for the DA. We might not think it's significant, but it's a huge significance. And this parallels the economic freedom fighters, which is Julius Malema's, which has attracted a lot of young black people, particularly young black men. So looking for economic freedom in a particular time, very contradictory. I mean, I'm a supporter of the EFF, but I'm highly critical of the EFF. Very contradictory in terms of very misogynist in very ways, trying to play the politics between appealing to the DA and appealing to the ANC. Traditionally, they come from the ANC. So they're very chatterist approach to the ideas, even though they put the slogan of like socialism in that thing, but they're not there. And it begs, even though that propaganda, which they would say they've grown from the local elections when they contested to the national elections, but they haven't grown enough to actually, they're under 2 million versus the DA. So there's something else happening here. That what I can tell you, when you look at also the elections, the last national elections, the ANC has remained with the 60 million. With the local elections, with a percentage they've dropped, but the people who vote, the actual numbers have not dropped. So something is happening, and nobody fully, truly understands what's happening. But there is a huge uneasiness that has actually, again, just before, for example, just before 1994 happened, the biggest, domestic killings where spouses kill each other. What is it? Domestic. Yes. It was huge in South Africa, okay? It was the highest in the world, where spouses will kill each other, or a spouse will kill the whole family. Again, there's a return of that, where domestic violence, gender-based violence is becoming, again, a key factor. So there's a number of reaction to a political and economic crisis that no one ideologically knows how to solve it. And it manifests itself in different ways. But at the bottom of it all is that majority of the Black people are still not empowered, that we have to think about. And nobody, even the movements that I belong, don't have a solution to these problems and themselves. We are ideologically bankrupt at the moment. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Phil?
Thank you very much. Actually, this is probably more a comment than a question. I just wanted to say I do appreciate one of the points you made that I thought is insightful is the fact that liberty doesn't necessarily translate into improving the status or the quality of lives of people. And I think it's something you can apply to so many places. Other African countries, when they got independence, it didn't necessarily improve lives. Here in America, every once in a while, someone says, what are Black people complaining about? There's no more segregation. So I was, the question you kind of answered in your last statement, you know, some of this, I was going to ask for, if you could propose some solutions. You mentioned a number of things like space has to change, regime has to change, ANC is in shambles, and that we need some ideological changes as well. You did mention that you don't think there has been a real grasp of the kind of ideology that would bring about this change, but you personally, do you have any any thoughts on that? And if you don't, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay. Okay. Oh, it should.
Why don't we take two questions and then you can answer those.
Thank you for a really interesting, fascinating presentation. So you talked a little bit at the end about xenophobia, and so I was wondering if you could expand on how that either like occludes these ideas or illuminates them, and sort of what role that plays in this larger consciousness.
Let me answer that one first before I answer your one. So I will speak for Johannesburg, for example. So there's been a huge gentrification that happens as well. So developers, the DA, for example, the Democratic Alliance. Sorry, yeah, I'm South African, so DA it's a sentence. So because we like acronyms. So the DA in particular, part of the funding, the party funding, is through developers. Okay. So developers have played an important role in this gentrification. In Cape Town, it's enormous. There's been movements in terms of like reclaiming the city where people have been literally evicted. Colored communities that have stayed there for generations have been evicted and so on. So there's aspects of that. How it works, proven, this is not rumors, is the developers are funding the party. And they actually, you know, through municipalities and actually the provincial have found ways to like rezone certain areas in order with a deal that they will get the money back. Same thing when the ANC lost in Gauteng, which is Johannesburg, the capital there, where the DA, in collaboration with the EFF, like they run in that province, Gauteng. Same thing where developers now they wanna, you know, the great plans of like changing the refrex of the city, and Johannesburg in particular has become a cosmopolitan city where a lot of African immigrants have come to Johannesburg and changed the fabric of the city in itself. Hillbrow, you know. Yovo, whatever area, is changed, and mainly occupied by African immigrants in particular. And of course, where does the narrative go? When that happens, too much crime or the dirt, there's so on. Now we need to develop this very cosmopolitan place into a clean, safe space. Drugs, sorry if you're Nigerian, but the story goes Nigerians are the drug dealers and so on. That's how it goes usually. Yes. Yes. So we need to clean up, which you cannot understand the rise, especially in Johannesburg now, without understanding the problem of developers and gentrification and how it's spilled together. They actually coexist. On top of it, where this is like the second wave of the xenophobic attacks, there was another one that happened in 2008. So how do we understand the 2008 versus this one? The 2008, there was a lot of Somalis coming to the township. So we had spaza shops, tuck shops, what is it? I don't know how to explain it here. Tuck shops.
7-Elevens.
Yes, okay. Yes, which historically were owned by black people in terms of we call them petty bourgeois shop owners and so on, Then when the Somalis came, they found ways to wipe out that petty bourgeois traditional black, shop owners that time. Created a huge resentment that also came and fueled by also shop owners who were historically been owning the shops. Now they have a competition and it became a huge process in it. With a huge unemployment at the time of the global financial crisis at the same time, that increased and propelled that xenophobic approach to the thing as well. So at that time, the movements were quite strong. The Marxist leftist approach. There was a huge demonstration in Johannesburg where people organized, huge political, going to the township, doing all reasoning with people. But as things get further, the movements, the left organization started to decline in two forms, because part of the movements, the problem, for example, anti-privatization forum was funded by Europeans as part of it. So when it declined, and also declined because funding, Europeans, all of a sudden you got your democracy and so on, therefore we can't find you. So a lot of organizations, especially the gay and lesbian organizations, the social movements like anti-privatization and so on, which were funded by those Europeans, funding started to come out of South Africa. That it created a huge decline because they were working with very, very impoverished organizations in different ways, and also a lot of LGBTI organizations started to close down because there was no money anymore. And that, when you think about it now, it weakened the movement. And when this wave happens, there was no left-wing politics to reason with the crisis that we're facing now, because there's no money to sustain those organizations in different ways. There's a few now with Reclaim the City, but they're struggling. I mean, some of the NGOs are closing down primarily because there's been a pull out of some of the funding that came particularly from Europe after 1994. So these are part of it, yeah, I would say. And would I answer his question? What are the solutions?
He's just stepped out, so maybe we can have you answer that when he comes back in. Yeah, another question? I think Eric in the back, am I heard?
Thank you. My name is Eric. I'm sorry I missed a chunk of your presentation because I was in another meeting, but I just wanted to ask a question in relation to the response you gave right now. I think I was struggling to understand your explanation quite well. I was thinking, with relation to the xenophobic attacks, do you think, like you made a comment, you said with the first wave or the 2008 one, Somalis found a way to wipe out the petty bourgeois shoppers. Do you think it is a problem of the immigrants who come, or individual South Africans, or a systemic thing that the state or the government is just unable to sort of accommodate? Because I'm from Ghana, we also have Chinese coming in, and beyond or in addition to the minings that they do, they also open shops. And Ghanaian traders will take to the street, go protest to the government that you need to do something, but they do not sort of perpetuate or sort of carry out what we see in South Africa. And so I'm wondering, is it an individual issue, a group issue, as in some organization is so pissed, or the immigrants issue, or it's a systemic thing? The state has not built structures to accommodate the influx of all of these changes.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think maybe to answer Philip's, I don't have an answer, to be honest. I do think one of the problems that actually, I believe in the working class and actually the agents of the working class to do it. But I think because for such a very long time, movements were built through funding. It created dependency. It created a point where me and my sushi activism can go to the masses, the working class, and create a disparity between them, like the everyday where they don't own a struggle. They depend on the academics like myself, the institutions like myself, to also be part of that struggle to find, I was the organizer of transport, I was the organizer of editing the memorandum, getting people buzzed to whatever, That was like my job in the movement as well, doing political pamphlets for them, going and teaching them, other things. Until the working class, know what we write as academics, actively themselves or find their own struggle, and actually debate and actually create an organic intellectuals, fully formed organic intellectuals who can debate outside or not only talk about the suffering, but seriously engage intellectually with us and traditional intellectuals. I don't think we'll get anywhere else. We'll still be in the circle of, the intellectuals in the movements are people who got PhDs versus the poor. It just doesn't work. In terms of the xenophobia, it's in multiple folds. One, is South Africa a violent country? It's extremely violent, okay? Don't panic. I think now when I see stories of the US, it's like, I don't know, I'm changing my mind. But, it's extremely, our history is violent. It's in our fabric in many levels to be violent. We're extremely opinionated, we're extremely, black men stab themselves. The highest murder of murder killings is actually black men stabbing themselves when they're hanging out drinking a beer. That's in that level. The levels, our history comes from huge levels of rape, which is continuous, imitates, but it's there. It's been there in various ways with a very violent regime. Therefore, with certain aspects that triggers a potential to harm will be there. In a moment of crisis, the fabric that manifests itself to the core is through violence, whether amongst ourselves or the other person. That's the way it has been. And also the system, structurally, the government, even the ANC, when, for example, with the Maragana, when they killed the mine, the inclination is to kill. It was the most hurtful moment in our history, but it was that inclination. We have that, which is, structural, but also in the everyday, that actually feed into each other. They're not separate. And it's also historical. So yes, hence it's easy to bend down things, to kill some, and so on and so forth. Yeah.
Kurt had a question.
I really enjoyed your presentation, and Mosa, could you talk a little bit about, expand your thoughts about the perspective that you've learned through your research of how higher education, universities are viewed, and cultural heritage institutions, and where do they fit in this ongoing effort to decolonize institutions, both museums and universities?
So let me speak about the history of higher education in particular, and it will link to the museums. So after 1994, there were mergers that happened. Not all universities agreed. So there was a merger of historically black universities with historically white universities in one level. So, I don't know, the University of Johannesburg, for example, merged with Vista. Vista, it was in Soweto. Most of the people you might know who were activists come from Vista University, was there. As well, it merged with a historically Afrikaans university in Johannesburg and became University of Johannesburg. So, and Walter Sisulu did the same in terms of the Bantustans. I don't know, it's a long, I'm sure that people know as well. So there's been different mergers. Some have worked, some haven't worked in different ways. There's been issues around then the staffing. When that happens, how do we deal with the staffing? Historically, for example, University of Johannesburg, the merger was successful in two ways because the Afrikaans University had the resources to do that. And the staffing in terms of was because there were a lot of historically white academics who were easily incorporated into the thing. Some of them were forced to do their master's and their PhD because some of them became academics without that, and so on. But in black universities, like Walter Sisulu, the disparity has been huge, and also administratively has been a crisis of how do we actually deal with black universities. And I think the only black university that is actually really functional, I think, is Fort Hare. The rest of the historically black universities remain black, and not only black, but actually the people who have kept academic staff in those universities are not South African black people, are actually people from the continent who have kept those universities for a very, very long time going. So there's been a core now of occupying historically black universities with black students, and also historically black universities, this is so much detail. Historically black universities have attracted students from very impoverished background, rural schooling, rural, impoverished. So they actually have the most under-resourced students going to under-resourced universities, which a lot of work has to be done in order to get them to the level of the university, where historically white schools, the black people who often go there, even though not all the time, but majority of the students who go there are from the townships and also come from former white schools. Like UCT, you can't think about UCT or Rhodes without thinking all the political children or black elites often go to those University of Cape Town and so on as particular. So there's been that. So how do we think about it? And then it's been, the higher education has been used as also a stepping stone of being middle class for black. And also it's been a stepping stone for which the ANC has done well to change the demographics. Actually, one of the good things the ANC has done is actually giving access to it. It has created crisis. There's too many students have been enrolled and so on, no classes, not enough academics, but actually you start to see actually a lot of black people coming to universities and occupying those spaces. There's been very small, stubborn universities, but large majority has changed. And then, it's a beacon of hope, and also because of the state fund and loans that people can get in order to go to, there's controversy, hence the fees must fall. But politically as well, it's been a key of like people have to go to universities, people have to do that. So there's been those ideas. So higher education, or especially higher education, then heritage side is like, how do we transform them for the greater good? Because there's been some changes in it. Has it been successful? No. And I think in one level it has, but I think one of the things is like the culture has remained very wide. I think that's where the contestation of decolonization has come in. And also how museums and galleries and other things have remained white through the white gaze. Academic, in terms of majority, is still very white. So there's been tension of like these black students coming, but actually at the top layers and academic and professors have remained white. So how do we deal with these spaces that have black students, but still creating a culture that is not actually incorporating black practitioners in museums or heritage sites with actually new ideas and new knowledge that actually can speak to the new audiences with white people or professors or practitioners who this is what they know. They've taught all the students, I assume only black students, now that they come in, they will teach them the same way as white people. Then if you don't pass, you're lazy. You know, so these have been contestations in it. I do think transformation has to happen both at the top, especially at the top. I think new knowledge has to happen. There's been huge resistance in terms of how we envision these spaces. How do we actually envision higher education? What is a university for? I think those are fundamental. For whom? And how do we think about it? We haven't thought about those questions. What is a museums for, or these heritage sites, and for whom? And who are the new people who are consuming these things? Those are the critical questions that I think personally we need to think about. And I think with the decolonization, it's starting to question that, but we're not yet in those fundamental questions yet.
I wanted to throw in one quick question.
This is the last question. So why don't you take it, Upen?
Someone else wanted to ask?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
So, do you mind talking a little bit about South Africa's place on the continent? So if you could branch outside what is happening in South Africa, but in terms of relationships in the SADC region, across the continent, and how do you think about what South Africa should do differently or better? And this is at one level addressing issues around South African exceptionalism, but beyond that, like what's the place of South Africa on the continent?
This will sound arrogant, but it's not. Take it with a pinch of salt. You know, this is like sarcasm in my head. I do think South Africa is important for the world because it brings two things. What does democracy look like in an African continent? Since we're the last people to be liberated, we're the last kids in this whole, after independence, we are the babies here, okay? So it brings different questions compared to the first wave of independence, since we're like, what does it look like? What does modernity look like in an African continent and also to the world? Is it possible to have democracy at all? And I think we are an experiment in all of these things in various ways. So I think on those questions, we become important. There's still potential, even in these contradictions and unevenness, there's still potential to think about those things, and there's still potential that it could work. That's how I see it. Has it been one of the things, the worst thing about the apartheid or colonization apartheid is that it has stripped our people to connect to the continent. And you won't understand it, like it's even in our educational system. It's in our fabric that actually it has stripped away, erased part of ourselves not being part of the continent. You know, I'll give you an example. Like, people actually, you know, like, they will say, yeah, no, they're Africans. Like, I'm not talking about South Africans. South Africans are not talking about themselves. They're talking about other Africans. Where are you going? I'm going to Africa. No, it's in that level of thinking that has stripped aspects of ourselves, and I think this is where little things like that about education, about understanding our own history as a people, this is the damage that apartheid has done fundamentally. That you cannot understand South Africa and its psyche without understanding the destruction that actually still reproduces itself generation after generation and will go on for the next generation in that level. That's what I will say.
Well, I think we might have time for one more question.
Okay.
Are you all?
Yeah.
Mosa, yeah.
Yes.
Is there another question? I think we can wrap up. I think there are lots of important things that we could talk about that we'll have an opportunity to engage further. And I'd just like to emphasize that Mosa and our colleagues from South Africa are part of a 3-year dialogue. So the themes and issues that we're discussing here this week with Funzo and Mosa, we're just at the very beginning of a conversation between MSU and Stellenbosch University. So I really encourage and invite everyone to come to the seminars. We'll be having a lot more seminars next year. If you're a student, think about the off-campus study opportunity that we're developing to do internships in Cape Town. And Mosa will continue to be part of the project. So we're hoping to deepen it and publish some things coming out of it. So it's going to be rich, and we've just started off with a great talk. So thank you so much for talking with us, Mosa, and thank you all once again for coming to Ion Africa.
Thank you.